Hi class. I'm going to do this PowerPoint lecture because I want you to have background context and biography on Dickinson in order to better understand her poetry. This is an optional PowerPoint, of course. So, the title of my presentation is I Dwell in Possibility, which comes from J657, a poem Dickinson wrote, and it goes like this. It's on page 3152 of your Heath. That's, of course, the 6th edition. I dwell in possibility, a fairer house than prose, more numerous of windows, superior for doors, of chambers as the cedars, impregnable of eye, and for an everlasting roof the gambrels of the sky, of visitors the fairest, for occupation this, the spreading wide my narrow hands to gather paradise. And of course, that is a designation of her chosen occupation of writing and poetry, which she finds more expressive than prose. Some of the images in this poem indicate that by saying that it has more numerous windows and more doors, more openings. And of course, with poetry, you're dealing with heavy connotations. Everything is so condensed. Dickinson is difficult to understand for many people on a first read, so don't feel bad if you find yourself puzzled when you read a Dickinson poem. Hopefully you'll be able to take away at least a better understanding of your assigned poem, if not some of the others. So her biography. She came from a reputable Amherst, Massachusetts family. Her father was quite the patriarch, Edward Dickinson, who was later the treasurer of Amherst College. Her mother, Emily Norcross, was an invalid for most of her life, but she had 1 year of higher education, which was rare for women of her time. Her family situation with her brother Austin was very interesting. He married her best friend, Susan Gilbert, and they lived in a house next door to her original homestead in Amherst. Of course, one of the major controversial strains of her biography is that she had a lifelong friendship and perhaps lesbian relationship with Susan Gilbert. She did, in fact, write poems, send her letters, and in some ways, Susan Gilbert was the only person she let edit and make suggestions about her writing. Lavinia, her sister, was the household caretaker, and she never married. She remained Emily's lifelong companion, and she was the one who said about Emily, she had the thinking to do. She attended Amherst Academy, a private girls' school, and that particular school had access to speakers that were invited to Amherst, so it was an exceptional place. When she attended Mount Holyoke Female Seminary, she found the curriculum challenging, but the pressure to commit to Christ was high and may have led to Emily's leaving after 2 terms. At the time, one of the officials of that college classified her as one who had no hope, i.e., she was not likely to be converted to Christianity. She was a proficient letter writer, and by the age of 12, she had was continuing a vigorous correspondence with friends and family. She continued that all of her life. She was famous for sending people poems and recipes in letters, and until very recently, people were finding these things in their attics. In her 20s, she was very active socially, since her homestead was central to all Amherst social life. Also in her 20s, she traveled to Philadelphia, where she met the Reverend Charles Wadsworth. He was rumored the mystery love of her life, and others speculate that mystery love, who's never been positively identified, may have been Samuel Bowles or Judge Otis Lord. In her 30s, she withdrew to her house and grounds. Some speculate because of disappointed love, and others because of creative control. In short, she was, most people believe, an agoraphobic. She was afraid of open spaces. But more probably to the point, she chose her house in a way to make sure that she had the space and the control to devote to her poetry. This poem is really about that choice. This is J303, one of your assigned poems. The soul selects her own society, then shuts the door to her divine majority present no more. Unmoved she notes the chariots pausing at her low gate. Unmoved, an emperor be kneeling upon her mat. I've known her from an ample nation. Choose one, then close the valves of her attention, like stone. Now, this picture here is of the homestead front door, and her room was up here in this corner. And because her home was on a major thoroughfare, she could see lots of traffic passing by. She could see who was coming to the house and decide whether or not she would go down to meet them. In some way, this is a metaphor for her interaction with the rest of the world. Again, she had to have her alone time in order to produce her poetry. Her sense of herself as a poet. In some of her early letters, we get this sense of herself and what she had to do. She compared herself to Austen, who got lots of attention for his poetic efforts. Now, Brother Pegasus, I'll tell you what it is. I've been in the habit myself of writing some things, and it rather appears to me that you're getting away my patent. Somewhat jokingly, of course, but of course it alludes to the fact that women's efforts were not taken as seriously as men's. One of the things I usually have students do is read the letters to Thomas Higginson in the back of the collection of poetry. He was an influential literary editor, and she asked for his advice early in her career. Her tone was playful, though, and grateful, and she never seemed actually to take his advice. You think my gait spasmodic. I am danger, sir. You think me uncontrolled. I have no tribunal. In other words, she knew that she was writing poetry that was way ahead of her time. And at this point, I might add the speculation that that is why she hid all of her poetry. She bound them in little booklets called fascicles and put them under her bed. Now, it's divided on whether or not she actually told Lavinia to burn them. Of course, Lavinia found them, and it was quite a surprise. And I believe the idea is that they were left unmentioned at her death. And so, without a positive command to publish them or to burn them, Lavinia took it upon herself to begin the process of editing and publishing them. Later, others came into that process. The family, Mabel Loomis Todd, and others decided to get in on the action. Mabel Loomis Todd was Austen's, I believe, his mistress. Yes, his mistress. And because of that tense relationship between Mabel and his wife Susan, there was lots of bickering over who had the rights to edit the different editions that came over, or that came across and were published in the next few years. Oh, this is a picture from the 2003 study tour. You've seen some of the photographs from other writers' house, and this is, of course, some of the students and me in front of the homestead. All right, well, this is a page from an archive, a website on Dickinson, and especially focusing on the editing process that went on between Emily and Susan. This particular poem is Safe in Their Alabaster Chambers, and it indicates that Sue critiqued the text while Dickinson was in the process of writing. Sue was a vital participant in the composition and transmission of the poem. And so this particular website is interesting for those of you who might want to someday pursue more work with Dickinson's poems. This is a poem that tells us about her view of poetry and poets. Many writers, such as Whitman, also made comments about their view of poetry and the place of the poet. I really enjoy this poem, and a few years back we used it as a theme for one of our Sigma Tau Delta induction ceremonies. The poets light but lamps themselves. Go out. The wicks they stimulate, if vital light, in here as do the suns, each age a lens disseminating their circumference. This is a very rich poem, and I'm afraid I can't do it justice in the time we have, but I will say this. The point here is that the poets leave behind something like a flame. And it takes or it doesn't. And each age, each generation takes up that flame. And if it catches, then it has an influence. Disseminating their circumference. Circumference is one of those big words in Dickinson studies. It meant a very special thing to her. Some people speculate it meant truth, others just influence, others the very innate essence of all of her work. Only 7 poems are published in her lifetime, and over 1,700 poems are found by Lavinia. Some were bound in fascicles. In 1890 to 91, 2 editions were rapidly sold out. Auster's mistress, Mabel Lubis Todd, helped to edit and publish, as I said before. She conventionalized the verse and removed some of the more radical elements. The family feud that ensued was between Susan Gilbert Dickinson, who retained half of her manuscripts, and Todd the other. The daughter of Todd, Millicent, and her daughter, the daughter of Susan, Martha Dickinson Bianchi, brought forth other editions. So this feud passed on to the next generation. Emily didn't have a very high view of publication, which this poem indicates. I won't read the entire thing, but you can see the primary metaphor is of auction. Publication is the auction of the mind of man. Poverty be justifying for so foul a thing? Possibly, but we would rather from our garret go white unto the white Creator than invest our snow. In other words, she would rather die than get paid for her poetry, which is a kind of different and strange place to be. I think in some ways it indicated the value she placed in her poetry. In the 20th century, Dickinson's manuscripts went through many changes. In 1932, the new critic, Alan Tate, moved criticism away from the speculative biography and myth of the nun of Amherst, remember the idea that she was a shut-in, and focused on the text itself. In 1955, Thomas Johnson produced the first complete scholarly edition of the poems from the manuscripts and in order without extensive editing, and that is who we have to thank for all the J numbers. The J numbers stand for Thomas Johnson's last name. In the 1980s, the feminist explorations occurred, including Shira Walski's, who argued that Emily Dickinson was tied to the center of political matters, her most productive period corresponding to the Civil War years, 1860 to 1865. And if on first glance, many people believed that her poems had nothing to do with the war, and it was strikingly absent. However, that was not the case with further reading. Was she removed? Yes. Did she experience it? Undoubtedly, but perhaps not in the way we would expect, and certainly not in the way that Whitman did. In 1998, the most recent publication, Franklin's new edition, renumbered and alerted readers to differences between manuscript and print versions of the poems. Okay, so now the question of whether or not Emily Dickinson was a Christian. Well, once again, she was living at a time in the 19th century following another kind of great awakening, not the one of the 18th century we learned about in association with Jonathan Edwards, but another one. It was a fervor. And the idea here is that when she went to Mount Holyoke College, remember, the seminary, they said that she was one of no hope, meaning that she didn't really accept, or she refused to accept some of the basic doctrines. And in saying that Dickinson's poetry was an art of belief, Roger Lundeen, who recently, a professor of Wheaton College, who recently died, by the way, wrote a very good book. And this particular book is based on the thesis he explains in this slide. Her poetry is in large measure, he writes, about belief, about the objects of belief and its comforts, as well as belief's great uncertainties. With daring tenacity, she explored the full range of human experience in her reflections upon such subjects as God, the Bible, suffering, immortality. And this is the key quotation for his book. On subjects of which we know nothing, or should I say beings, she wrote, a few years before she died. We both believe and disbelieve 100 times an hour, which keeps believing nimble. All right, so this poem, J324, was one of the poems that we were supposed to read for today. I did not assign it to any of you because I wanted to cover it here in this lecture. And so if we get to it in class tomorrow, fine. If not, you have it here. As I told you in your assignment, I asked you to look up words in poems that you may not know, and that's a pretty standard piece of advice for any poetry. However, with, Dickinson, it's particularly important. So she mentions a bobolink, which is a kind of bird, and that's a picture right there. A chorister is a singer in a choir, and surplice is the white gown worn by clergymen. A sexton is a church custodian who often took, care of the grounds. The poem reads, "Some keep the Sabbath going to church. I keep it staying at home, with a bobolink for a chorister and an orchard for a dome. Some keep the Sabbath in surplice. I just wear my wings. And instead of tolling the bell for church, our little sexton sings. God preaches, a noted clergyman, and the sermon is never long. So instead of getting to heaven at last, I'm going all along." The idea behind this poem indicates her relationship to the world and to heaven. She was very distrustful of the afterlife. She didn't know what existed, and she didn't pretend to. She speculated in many of her poems. Here she indicates that her world, the world of nature, birds, and, that little sexton singing, was so lovely and so like paradise that she didn't really need an afterlife in order to find fulfillment. The subject of death. Emily experienced the death of her mother and father. Her nephew, the 5-year-old Gilbert Dickinson, happened in the early 1880s. She also experienced the death of many neighbors, and vicariously so with the house across the street, which was entitled the Sorrow House. By the way, that's now a bed and breakfast in which we stayed. Some speculate that the poem J49, mentioning God as a burglar and banker, indicates her relationship to death and shows her disbelief in a being that would first give you a gift, such as a cherished loved one, and then take him away. Well, this particular B&B was an interesting place to be in, and I'll tell you why, because there was I don't know how they did it. They had very little lighting, and so at night it was as dark as pitch and spooky. All right, this question about whether or not Dickinson had any relationship to the Civil War is an interesting one, and one that, of course, scholars since Shira Wolski have taken up. Okay, so one of the articles I read by Folsom showed this particular poem that I have in this slide, F144, which is the Franklin number. I don't believe it is in your particular anthology. Could this poem be read on one level as Dickinson's response to the numerous stories of fugitive slave escapes? And so some of these images indicate that. I never hear the word escape without a quicker blood, a sudden expectation, a flying attitude. I never hear of prisons broad by soldiers battered down, but I tug childish at my bars, only to fail again. Did she, in fact, internalize the effects of being trapped? Of course, living at home and being close with her family, she wouldn't have necessarily gone out and visited, for instance, the wounded soldiers in the hospitals, as did Whitman. But did she not react and internalize? That's what is speculated with this poem. And with these, the war, and this is a picture, I don't know if you can see it very well, of a dead soldier in the field. And by the way, there are a lot of them available on the internet, and they're quite grisly. So I won't read all of this poem, but you can see a few key phrases. When she sets up the poem by saying, "My portion is defeat today, a paler luck than victory." In other words, what is it like to walk among the dead? And here's another one. "'Tis populous with bone and stain, and men too straight to stoop again." I mean, they're dead, right? And one of my favorite lines, and piles of solid moan, and chips of blank and boyish eyes. So, in other words, this is a very visible reminder and very poignant reminder that she had in fact experienced, if not the actual walking through the fields of dead soldiers, she saw many of these pictures. And here is my works cited. I hope this will be helpful to you, and we'll see you in class.